Look at this nickel. You've held this man's face in your hand 1,000 times, but you were never told the truth about what he was actually looking for. History says Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark west to find a path to the Pacific. That is a lie. In 1804, the President of the United States commissioned the most expensive, systematic cover-up in human history. He didn't send the Corps of Discovery to find a river. He sent them to find the giants that were still making the sounds he heard in the dark. Before the expedition ever left, the president was personally cataloging massive bipedal remains found in a West Virginia cave, remains that shouldn't exist according to every textbook you've ever owned. He called them megalonyx, and he didn't believe they were extinct. He believed they were still out there, and he sent Meriwether Lewis to find them. I didn't start this investigation because I like history. I started it because I found a series of letters in the Library of Congress that seemed to belong to a man being consumed by a primal, biological fear. A man who wasn't just a statesman, but an obsessive hunter of things that don't fit the human timeline. Jefferson sent Lewis to Philadelphia, not for military drills, but to be trained by the nation's top anatomists. He needed Lewis to be able to identify bones, to distinguish between the remains of an animal and something bipedal. Something that looked like us, but on a scale that shouldn't be possible. The instructions are public record, but the version you've seen has been sanded down. Jefferson's orders were explicit. Observe the remains and vestiges of those which are deemed rare or extinct. He was looking for the people who built the Mound Belt. If you've ever driven through the Ohio River Valley or the Mississippi Corridor, you've seen them. Those soft, green, symmetrical hills we call mounds. We treat them like landscape features. But Lewis and Clark were traveling through the densest concentration of ancient high-tech engineering on the planet, and they were doing it under the shadow of Jefferson's ghost, a lingering command to find out exactly what was buried inside them before the public ever got a look. The anomaly isn't just that they found things, the anomaly is the silence. When you read the published journals, the descriptions are strangely flat. They talk about the soil, they talk about birds, but they refuse to acknowledge what was inside the rooms they were walking through. There is a specific, heavy void in the narrative where the discovery should be. I call it the gap in the record. I read the 1814 edition 3 times before I let myself understand the pattern. Every time the expedition reached a site of massive complexity, earthworks that required sophisticated geometry, the journal entry for that day suddenly becomes obsessed with the weather. It's not that they weren't looking, it's that the record was being sanitized in real time. Meriwether Lewis wasn't a writer, he was a soldier, he was methodical, and yet his field notes from the most critical weeks of the journey, the weeks they spent inside the Mound Belt, simply do not exist in their original form. We have the compiled versions, we have the edited volumes, but the raw physical paper from those specific days, it's the gap in the record, again. There's a moment in 1804 near the Missouri River where they stop at a place the local tribes called the Mountain of the Little People. Lewis writes about a profound sense of unease. He describes a tradition of spirits with large heads. He's sitting in a tent, the smell of damp ink and river water around him, trying to find words for something that shouldn't be there. He was a man of the Enlightenment, standing on top of a tomb he couldn't explain. And here is where it becomes impossible to ignore. The Smithsonian's own 1883 reports from these exact same sites, untouched since Lewis passed them, describe skeletons 7.5 feet tall, jawbones that could slide over a modern man's face like a mask. These were the sites Lewis was ordered to catalogue 80 years earlier. The mounds weren't empty, they were full. So the question isn't whether the remains were there, The question is why the first federal expedition to see them decided to look away. Why did they agree to the silence? It suggests a level of intentionality that is difficult to process. It's what I've started calling the coordination problem. How do you ensure that a group of explorers all agree to omit the same category of evidence? You don't need to burn the books if you can control who writes the first draft. I need to be careful here, but when you look at the timeline of Meriwether Lewis's life after he returned, the way his mind fragmented, the way he became obsessed with securing his papers, you start to see the cost of the lie. He didn't come back a hero. He came back a man who was carrying a secret that was too big for the American map to hold. And by the time he reached that cabin on the Natchez Trace in 1809, he wasn't just running from his debts, he was running from Jefferson's ghost.
Let's talk about the cabin. October 1809, the Natchez Trace. It's a narrow, muddy trail through the wilderness of Tennessee. Meriwether Lewis is staying at a place called Grinder's Stand. He's 35 years old, he's the governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, and he is carrying 2 trunks filled with his original, unedited field notes. The official story is that Lewis, in a fit of depression, shot himself twice, once in the head, once in the chest, and then lingered for hours, asking for water. It's a messy, improbable death for a soldier of his caliber. His family didn't believe it. William Clark didn't believe it. But more importantly, the trunks were opened. When the papers finally reached Washington, they were incomplete. The specific journals covering the mound belt of the Ohio Valley, the observations of the strange high-tech infrastructure found in the desert, the detailed anatomical sketches Lewis was trained to produce, they were gone. This is where the gap in the record stops being a mystery and starts looking like a policy. We are taught that the American West was a wilderness, a virgin land waiting for a civilized hand to guide it. But if Lewis's notes were as visceral as the 1894 Smithsonian report suggests, if he was seeing skeletons 7 feet tall and irrigation systems that shouldn't have existed, then the wilderness was a graveyard. And you can't build a new empire on top of a graveyard if the people you're displacing realize they're walking on the bones of giants. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the expedition wasn't a journey of discovery, but a journey of inventory? What if Jefferson already knew what was out there, and he needed Lewis to confirm exactly how much of it needed to be buried before the settlers arrived? It would explain why the publication of the journals was delayed for nearly a decade. It would explain why the 1814 edition reads like it was written by a committee of censors. And it would explain the coordination problem. Think about the logistics of 1804. No telegraph, no railway, a continent that took months to cross. To erase a discovery of this scale, you need a level of institutional discipline that is almost supernatural. You need everyone, the soldiers, the surveyors, the scientists, to agree on a single silent lie. Or maybe they didn't have to agree. Maybe they just had to be afraid. I found a reference to a room in the White House. It was called the Mammoth Room. It was the East Room, technically, but during Jefferson's term, it was filled with bones. Not just mammoth teeth and mastodon tusks, but crates of artifacts sent back by Lewis. For years, the President of the United States lived in a house filled with the remains of a civilization that didn't fit the history books. I've stood in the East Room. It's all gold leaf and chandeliers now. It's designed to project power and stability. But I couldn't stop thinking about the weight of those crates on the floorboards. I couldn't stop thinking about what it feels like to sit in a room and know that the world outside is built on a foundation of missing pages.
The Smithsonian's 12th annual report, this is 1894 now, is the most uncomfortable document in American archaeology. It's nearly 800 pages of official mound explorations, and tucked into the dry, bureaucratic prose are descriptions that make the blood run cold. Page 426. A skeleton of very large size, the skull large enough to fit over a man's face. Page 432. A copper mask found on a skull of unusual proportions. These aren't fringe claims. This is the government's own accounting. But look at what happens after 1894. Suddenly, the mound builders are reclassified. The giants become pathological anomalies. The massive earthworks are attributed to unorganized migratory tribes, despite the clear evidence of advanced mathematics and celestial alignment. The silence wasn't a single act of suppression. It was a slow, structural grinding, a policy of systematic incuriosity. I keep returning to Jefferson's ghost. It's not a haunting in the traditional sense, it's a template. He set the tone for how the American state would handle things that don't fit the narrative. You collect them, you inventory them. You put them in a mammoth room where the public can't see them, and then you let the papers go missing. I've spent months looking for the 1809 trunks. There are rumors they ended up in a private archive in Virginia. There are stories that they were burned by a fearful family member. But I think they're still in the system. The evidence suggests that the gap in the record is a physical space. It's a vault or a basement or a classified folder that holds the version of America we aren't allowed to inhabit. And once you see the gap, the map of the country changes. You realize the highways were built to bypass the mounds. You realize the cities were built on top of the ruins. You realize that the reason and enlightenment we see on the face of the nickel are just a thin silver skin. Underneath, it's all bones, and the bones are still there, just shallow enough that you might trip over them if you stop looking where they tell you to. I'm starting to think that Meriwether Lewis didn't die because of what he found. He died because he realized that the discovery was actually a funeral, and he was the one who had to dig the hole. The more I looked, the more I realized that the silence isn't a lack of data, it's a specific type of data. In the specialized world of archival research, we talk about archival silences, the places where records were deliberately not kept. But this is something else. This is a presence that has been sanded down until it looks like a void. I've spent the last 3 nights in a rented room with the 1894 Smithsonian report spread across the floor. The paper is old, that specific kind of brittle that feels like it's waiting to turn to dust. And there's a smell, a metallic ozone scent that comes off these old institutional volumes. It's the smell of a shelf that hasn't been touched in a century. I keep looking at the sketches of the mounds in Illinois and West Virginia. These aren't just piles of dirt. They are precisely aligned, functionally integrated engineering projects. And I keep thinking about what that Smithsonian report inadvertently admitted before the narrative was locked down for good. They described a Menuet shrine, a place where the artifacts were so sophisticated that the researchers simply stopped trying to explain them. Then, after 1894, the reports change. The language becomes colder, more dismissive. The extraordinary size of the remains is replaced by terms like mistaken measurement or exaggerated account. This is the coordination problem in its final, most successful form. You don't need to burn the books if you can convince the next generation that the authors were simply too stupid to see the world correctly. You just reclassify the anomaly as a hallucination. I went back to the nickel, not the face this time, the back. Look at Monticello, Jefferson's home.
his little mountain. It's designed as a monument to order, to the Enlightenment, to the Greek and Roman ideals he wanted to plant in American soil. But if you visit and you look at the floor plans for the original cabinet of curiosities he kept there, you'll notice something. The cabinet was emptied the day he died. There are inventory lists from 1826 that mention remains of a great size being crated up. They weren't sold, they weren't gifted to a museum, they were accessioned, which is a bureaucratic word for moved into a basement. I need to be careful with this next part. I can't state it as fact. I can only say it appears in more than one place in the margins of the Bureau of Ethnology's private memos. There are references to a facility, not a museum, but a storage site located beneath the streets of Washington, D.C., a place where the pathological anomalies from the 19th century excavations were sent to be forgotten. It suggests that the gap in the record isn't just a metaphor, it's a physical weight. It's thousands of tons of bone and copper and engineered stone sitting in the dark, just a few feet beneath the sidewalks where people walk to work. I'm tired. My hands have been shaking since I finished the section on the Kanawha Valley. It's not a tremor of fear exactly. It's the physical absurdity of standing next to a history that is so much larger than the one I was taught. The horror of Lewis and Clark isn't what they found in the woods, it's what they brought back in their heads. They saw a world that was already old, already engineered, already inhabited by something massive, and they had to come home and pretend they were the first ones there. That's what Jefferson's ghost is. It's the requirement to lie about the scale of the past so we can feel comfortable in the present. The expedition ended in 1806. Lewis died in 1809. Jefferson died in 1826. But the process they started, the naming, the categorizing, the burying, it never stopped.
We're still in the middle of it. We're still living in a country that is being administratively concluded. Every time you drive past one of those soft, green hills in the Midwest, you aren't looking at a hill, you're looking at a ceiling. And somewhere, in a basement in D.C. that doesn't appear on any public map, the floor is still covered in the dust of the people who were too big for our history books to hold. The nickel is still in my pocket. I can feel the weight of it against my leg. It's cold. It's small. I'm looking at the back of it now. At the house. The door to the cabinet is closed. Jefferson is still inside. The lights in the reading room are flickering. It's almost time for the archives to close. I have to put the books back. I have to walk out into the street and pretend the ground is solid. But I know what's under the pavement. A human jawbone, 12 inches wide, resting in a wooden crate.